Good evening, participants. We are just waiting for the minister to connect. By in between that, we will start with proceedings with the APB anthem, which will be broadcast right now, and then we will connect with the minister soon as he connects.
I'm here.
Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
Right. Okay. We have also Honorable Minister connected, so we could start our proceedings. Tusita, you can go with the APB anthem, please.
We are committed. Since 1988, we stand united. Our loyalty is with integrity. Do what is best for our community. We are the members of the APB,
serving all who are in our society.
Be they wealthy, be they meek,
What's best for them we'll see.
standing firm for all that we should be. We do what's good for backing governance. Learn the rules and give them prominence. Let's make sure of what is truly right. Then we'd be a trusted light. We are the members of the APB, serving all who are in our society.
Onwards to the future.
We do ascend, we challenge and tests. We shall contend by building on the strength we uphold. With bad ethics, we'll be bold. Empowering professionals, we are committed. Since 1988, we stand united. We stand united.
Thank you, Tusita. We will start the proceed now. Economic revival and transformation is the key in any budget. It's the foundation which the trust for development and sustainability is built on. This budget has been seen as an evenly poised budget centered on economic development to revive the country this post-COVID era. At the outset, APB wishes to congratulate the Honorable Minister of Finance and the officials behind who worked tirelessly to make a successful budget and prepare ourselves for economic growth in the future. The Association of Professional Bankers as a professional body has this annual event to keep awareness of its membership on the updates of the budget as well as the recent developments that will take in the economic side. And this is organized by the Continuous Professional Development Committee of APB. With this, I would hand over proceedings to our President, Aruna Fernando, Chief Risk Officer, Seylan Bank, to deliver the welcome address and introduce our Honorable Speaker, Honorable Minister, Mr. Ajith Nivard Cabraal. Over to
Good
you,
evening,
Andrew.
ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the APB Budget Forum. The Association of Professional Bankers Sri Lanka has been very active in the banking arena of the country since 1988, especially for the professional development of our members. Despite the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, APB has been very active this year, and we have already held 4 online webinars on several important banking related topics. Today, we are having this online forum to dissect, analyze, and discuss the key features of the government budget for the year 2021, which was presented in the parliament by Prime Minister Honorable Mahinda Rajapaksa few days ago. Budget 2021, which was presented under the theme Vistas of Prosperity and Splendor, outlines the government's strategic plans to generate revenue, conduct development activities, the social welfare measures to be undertaken by the government, and most importantly, the policy framework of His Excellency President Gotabaya Rajapaksa's government during the next 3 years. Banking is an industry which is heavily impacted by these policy decisions by the government, and as such, all of us need to be fully aware of the proposed changes under the budget 2021 to effectively manage our businesses. It is with great pleasure that we wish to inform you that we are privileged to have a very strong, eminent, and credible panel, starting from Mr. Lakshman Silva, Director Chief Executive Officer of DFCC Bank and Chairman of Sri Lanka Bankers Association, Mr. Duminda Hulangamuwa, Senior Partner at ENY Sri Lanka, Mr. Deshal de Mel, Senior Independent Director of Sampath Bank PLC and Research Director at Verité Research, Mr. Anushka Wijesinha, Independent Director of Seylan Bank PLC, to look into the budget proposals in detail at this online forum under the coordination of our Vice President and Chairman of Continuous Professional Development Committee, Mr. Jeremy De Silva. But most importantly, we have the honor of having the State Minister of Money, Capital Markets and State Enterprise Reforms, Honorable Ajith Nivard Cabraal, to deliver the keynote speech today. Mr. Cabraal is no stranger to the banking industry, having functioned as the 12th Governor of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka during the period 2006 to 2015. In our opinion, Mr. Cabraal is one of the best persons in the country to talk about the budget 2021 with his vast experience in financial services industry at very high levels. Recently, he was quoted in the media as saying, Budget 2021 is a growth-oriented budget that strives to get our country's macroeconomic fundamentals right and provides the bedrock for the development work planned by the government. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our keynote speaker for the day, Honorable Ajith Nivard Cabraal, to address this forum. Thank you. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. I must say I'm delighted to be here this evening with all of you to share a few thoughts on the budget, as well as provide you with some insight into the philosophy, as well as the thinking that went into budget making. As you know, every budget is important because that sets out the next year's program and as to how the next year's program will be funded, what kind of expenditure we will have to bear, and the other details of that basis. And at the same time, when it's a government, we also have to ensure that we are giving a message as to which direction we want the economy to move. We want different segments of the economy to move, and what we would be giving priority as being the thrust areas that will be concentrated upon by the government and what we would like the people as well as the business community to reflect on as we go along in the year. This year's budget is in a way no different from others because budgets have to take a long-term focus and deal with the situation as to how we would make the country grow, the economy to grow, how we would deal with our macro fundamentals and the challenges that we face, and how we would ensure that there is continuous investment coming into the country. So this year is no different, and the stability that we have been able to achieve as a result of the election of the president as well as of parliament, which has a 2/3 majority now, is essentially an important foundation on which the budget would be built upon. Now, as we all know, Sri Lanka is going through a difficult period with regard to the pandemic, no different from any other country. We all have to go through this pain, but we have undergone this kind of pain in the past as well. We have had oil at $145 per barrel. We have had the war that ravaged our country to a great extent for over 30 years, and we had to live with that. We had to live with the conditions that were imposed on us through the war. We had to deal with the global economic crisis. We dealt with the global banking crisis. All of you as bankers know that that has been a tremendous threat to the entire industry of the world. But we still kept on going. And the average rate of growth during the period of President Mahinda Rajapaksa, in which I was privileged to serve as the governor of the central bank, we had growth averaging 6.5% in those 9 years. So notwithstanding all these challenges, because we had a very clear focus and a function that was determined by the long-term vision of the president as well as that had been endorsed by the country, we were able to keep a single-minded approach and go forward. So this year is no different. Sometimes people ask me, why isn't there a mention of the COVID in greater detail in the budget speech and in the budget papers? I tell them that it is a normal occurrence for countries to face challenges. But we have to maintain our focus on the long-term vision. If we are thinking of making or taking our child to become a doctor, even if he gets ill in between and has measles, we're not going to give up that goal. We still will pursue that goal, but we'll have a little bit of a setback for a few days, maybe months, or maybe a year, but yet the goal remains constant. And the goal remains as one of our deliverables that we have to ensure that we deliver. So in the same way, a country has to have a long-term vision, and that has been provided by the president's vision of a prosperous Sri Lanka. We call it the Saubhagya Dakma, and that's where we are going. Now, in order to go there, we have to have certain parameters set in motion. Now, that's what this budget intends to do. The first in my mind, which is crucial and critical, is to ensure that there is new investment flowing into the country. This investment can be in the form of local investment, in the form of foreign investment. It can be equity, it can be loans, it can be a whole gamut of different types of instruments that will bring in the cash and the inflows. But the bottom line is that we have to have fresh infusions of money into the system. Now that's an important part. And in order to deliver that, what should we be doing? Now that's what the budget spells out. The budget talks about various incentives for the capital markets. It talks about tax incentives. It talks about improvements in efficiency. It talks about improvements in efficiency of the government sector. It talks about how we would gather new avenues of receipts in the form of new inflows into the country. Now, all these are designed to bring in that new capital into the country, which would spur the growth. Now, that's an important part which we have ensured is possible to be done in the country through these measures that we have put in place. The second most important part is to have sound macro fundamentals. Sound macro fundamentals are not only the taxing part or the fiscal part. Sound macro fundamentals must be in total. We must have benign inflation levels. Our debt levels must be manageable. The debt mix must be in such a way that we can easily deal with that situation. Our risks must be minimized. The support that we are giving to industry and commerce as well as agriculture through the initiatives that we take in the overall support must be strong. So these are all important parts of the macroeconomic fundamentals. Now, how do we achieve that? I think the two key macro fundamentals, as you as bankers also know, are the exchange rate stability and the interest rate stability. Now, what it means is we have to have exchange rates which are predictable. People must not be expected to have huge fluctuations in the rate at which the Sri Lankan currency is moving against other currency. Now, I remember way back in 2013, 2014, some of the people, including the bankers, used to criticize our management, saying that we have too stable a rupee. Now, after 5 years of heavy depreciation, which has had an enormous cost on our economy, I think people have begun to realize how important it is to ensure that the macro fundamentals are managed and positioned in such a way that the rupee would stay stable. Now, it may mean that sometimes the banks don't make that much of money because your arbitrage ranges are not all that huge, but still for all, you'll probably make a lot more money because you will have the ability to grow much faster because you have a overall system which is much more stable. Now, just to give you a perspective, I can tell you that as a result of the depreciation of the currency over the last 5 years, Sri Lanka's debt increased by 1,772 billion rupees. That's an enormous amount of money, 1,772 billion rupees. There was at one time criticism that the amount of borrowings for the Hambantota port, which was in the range of about 125 to 130 billion rupees, was too much. But corresponding to that borrowing, there was a port which subsequent government could sell off. But in this instance, we have got a borrowing of 1,772 billion, which has got included into our debt, which is a part of the debt of 13 trillion rupees that we inherited in the early part of 2020. A large part, in fact, 1.8 trillion of that out of the 13 trillion was only because of the rupee depreciation. At the same time, we had widely rising interest rates. Now, what happens when your interest rates rise up is that your debt servicing is a lot more challenging. Now, Japan has a debt to GDP ratio of around 256%. But their debt servicing cost is very, very minimal because their interest rates are very small, very, very low. The debt for Japan is in yen, so therefore there is no risk of depreciation or no risk of conversion. Now, in Sri Lanka, we were managing that process also very carefully up until 2014 end, at which time Sri Lanka's local debt to foreign debt was in the range of 58% of local debt and 42% of foreign debt. And we were gradually attempting to bring that down to the range of about 60% of local debt and 40%. But what did we see at the end of 2019? We have got half and half of local to foreign debt. Now, what happens as a result? We then have stress of exchange rate depreciation, which sometimes can be quite challenging for a government and for industry as well. Even your clients must be having serious repercussions to be dealt with as a result of these two issues not being stable. So, as soon as we came in, what did we do?
Hello.
We ensured that the rupee stays stable. And next, we ensured that Sri Lanka's interest rates also became stable. Now, as a result of that, we have made the platform a lot more stable. Now, the build-up of investment can be a lot more stable, a lot more stronger, and we can see that already happening. Just yesterday, agreement to have an investment of $300 million was signed in Hambantota, which is the Hambantota port city, and that was going to be one of the new investments that will come into Sri Lanka. That is going to absorb about 125 acres of the total 400-acre plots that have been earmarked for new industries. So you can already see, that already there are new ventures coming and taking positions in Sri Lanka. At the same time, we were assured that the Chinese investors who are investing in the port city project in Colombo, they are also now been able to gather $1 billion of investments, which will be another new impetus for the Sri Lankan growth story. So I'm sure the bankers will be interested in knowing all that stuff, because that would open out new opportunities for yourselves as well. And we expect you to do that. We expect you as bankers to play your role by ensuring that you support these businesses. We did have a tough time with COVID-19, and the shock that we had to endure was a severe one. You know that we had to take some serious measures in curtailing imports as well. And a few questions were asked from me, even in Parliament, as to why we had curtailed imports. And in fact, some of the ambassadors had also queried. But what we want to tell everyone is that if we had not taken that very bold and key decision, and we had unlimited imports coming in, and the rupee suffered as a result, and if the rupee had gone to, let's say, 250 rupees for a dollar, or to 300 rupees a dollar, anyway, the imports would have stopped. There would have been no imports that we could have been talking about. Because we had to make sure that Sri Lanka's macro fundamentals are managed in a certain fashion. And sometimes you've got to take some tough decisions as well. Now, if you take the situation by curtailing the imports for a reasonable period of time and only allowing certain essentials to come in, we have stabilized the rupee. We have now been able to relax some of those items to come in without any further tension being caused to the macro fundamentals. We have also ensured that our debt position is retained without any difficult situation cropping up. Because we got to understand, Parliament has to vote for every dollar the equivalent amount in rupees in order to repay. So if you had 4 billion rupees, $4 billion to repay this year, and we had a 10 rupee depreciation, that's additional 40 billion rupees that had to be earmarked, which needs to come from some other source. Now, by curtailing these kinds of big numbers to manageable levels, we have been able to bring a discipline into the economy, which even, I must say, these big guys like the IMF and the World Bank never advised us. These are out of our own bat. We know that this is the way to go. And that's the important part. Now, why some people are thinking that Sri Lanka will have a challenge in repayment is because they expect all these conditions to remain the same. We don't expect it to remain the same. We expect it to improve. We are taking the necessary steps to improve that. That's why we are promoting investments to come in. We are ensuring that unnecessary imports are stopped so that we will manage this system. We are promoting a lot more exports, even in the difficult times of the COVID and quarantine. We allowed exports to occur. Sometimes people think that exports occurred only because of their efforts. Yes, we do appreciate the efforts of the private sector in doing so. But the port had to work, the customs had to work, the banks had to work, the police had to work, the transport systems had to work. All those other systems also had to work in order to provide the support for these things to occur. So the position of government is we would like to support all these ventures to go forward, and that's part of the growth strategy. Now, at the same time, Sri Lanka needs to have an evenly poised economy, that like what was introduced by your president, what he said. Now, if that is to happen, we got to ensure that all the people in this country have some benefit from the policies that we are implementing. Now, that's the important part of the overall exercise that we are putting in place. Now, how do we do that? If you remember, way back in 2006 to 2014 period, we allowed, one of the main thrusts of our development activity was to provide electricity to the people of this country. Only 70% of the people had electricity, but we upped that to almost 99%. This time round, under President Gotabaya Rajapaksa, we are keen to ensure that people who do not have water on tap are provided with that facility. Only about 42% of the people of our country have water on tap. Now we want to increase that to at least 95%. That would mean that there has to be substantial investment in that field, and we are putting money down in that area so that we can deliver that benefit to the people. The benefit of that is valued not by people in Colombo who already have water, but in the outstations, in areas where there is no water and people have to walk sometimes 2-3 kilometers to bring water and come back to their homes to bathe the children. So that is being looked after. We are also developing 100,000 kilometers of road. And that's another important part, to make sure that our entrepreneurs, our business people, our people are having the necessary infrastructure to carry out their activities in a lot more stable and more beneficial manner. Now, these are important parts of the overall equation. And whilst we are providing the space for businesses, the large-scale businesses that I think Association of Professional Bankers are normally dealing with, I'm sure some of your other colleagues in the various parts of the country are also alive to these problems that I'm talking about. But by and large, in the main balance sheet of the banks, you don't see these things. But it's important for us to reflect on these items when we go forward as a country. So we got to have evenly balanced development. And in order to do that, we have taken steps of this nature to carry it through. Another part of the budget that is, I think, vital for you to reflect upon is the support that we are giving to capital markets. Our capital markets have been in the doldrums for a long time. I remember in 1993, when I was the president of the Institute of Chartered Accountants, I was a member of the Securities and Exchange Commission. And at that time also, there were around 200 odd companies which were listed in the stock exchange. Today also, we still have around 200 odd companies listed. But now we need to break free from that situation. We need to now go into a new mode and truly align the stock exchange and the capital markets with the growth of our country. Now, if we are to do that, we have to give certain incentives, and we have done that. But we now want to see the bankers and the business people, the stock exchange, the SEC, all of them getting together to have a key goal of at least listing 500 companies by the end of 2025, and ensuring that the total market capitalization of the capital market will be at least 75% of GDP by that time. These are not easy challenges. These are fairly tough goals to achieve. But that's where we need to go. Because otherwise, if we stay still, I don't think we can get anywhere too far. So Sri Lanka has taken some bold steps. We have given these incentives for you to actually transform this economy. It's not to just let these be and have discussions to say, hey, that's a good thing to do, kind of thing. But we want you to get involved in these activities to ensure that you actually deliver some of these results on the ground. So you need to have your companies being listed. You need to have new startups being listed. You need to have SME sector being listed. You need to have the big companies, the BOI companies being listed. You need to get their debt listed. You need to have people who will say, I will borrow and I will issue debentures, and those debentures should be listed in the stock exchange. You will have the REITs. Now already REITs have been introduced. And I think the time is right for these new instruments to come in and be placed in the right positions in our economy. If you do that, you'll probably find that we will be having a very interesting journey as we go along. We're also concentrating on certain items of activity, which we used to generally rely on foreign companies supplying to us being done here itself. Sometimes we call it import substitution, but I like to think of it as an expansion of our economy, not just a negative connotation of doing certain things as import substitution. When we are importing $20 billion worth of items into the country, what does it mean? It means that we have a market in Sri Lanka which can absorb $20 billion worth of goods to come in and services to come in. When we say we are exporting 12 billion or 11.5 billion, what it means is we are exporting that much. But we are importing double of what we export. So our market is not so small. We are actually having a large market of 20 billion, which we are not making use of. So if we can convert some of those demands into our own activities, economic activities, and benefit by that kind of a demand that we ourselves are seeking from outside to be fulfilled, I think we have a winner. So that's why certain steps that we have taken with the import curtailment in the last few months is actually an eye-opener for us. We need to take advantage of that. And then we need to make sure that we will be able to make use of those new normal and then get going to see whether we can substitute some of those items that we are importing and to manufacture it here. Another good thing that happened with COVID was that our remittances, which were expected to dwindle, have actually done well. We looked into that very closely, and we found that some of the informal channels that used to be the channel longer available as a result of the COVID challenge, and they had to use the banking channels of your bankers to bring that in. Now, what does that tell you? It tells you that you have a fantastic opportunity. What was $500 million just before COVID as the remittances that used to come into this country per month has risen to $700 million. Now you need to see what is that $200 million and how did it come, and make use of the fact that this could come in through official channels and use maybe new apps or new instruments in order to generate that even post-COVID period. So that would be an extraordinary transformation that you would be engineering yourselves, which will benefit your banks as well if you were to do that. Now, these are the types of activities I think you should take advantage of. If you have $200 million more per month, you're looking at $2.5 billion. $2.5 billion is the country's oil bill. So just imagine if we can generate that kind of a new inflow into the country in foreign exchange, you have done a tremendous transformation within our economy. Now, some people might even not realize, but it would be an amazing reform. Sometimes reforms are available if we are to search for it carefully. Sometimes it is at our grasp. And this is something that we have been given insight into. So I would like to see bankers making use of this opportunity, and hopefully we can maintain that. So in the midst of a lot of people saying that we have not been able to make use of the COVID situation, I think there are plenty of opportunities that we have. Another part that I want to mention to you is, if we are to stimulate growth, we got to have investments in this country. Now, in the investments, not only will we be keen to see private sector investment, we ourselves are going to put our money down where our mouth is. Sri Lanka has government projects of around 289 right now in progress. That comes under some purview of my ministry, where we are examining the performance as well as looking at the project management aspect of those projects. And we find that some of those projects, actually a lot more than some, so many projects are behind schedule and not on budget. So we got to transform that to be on time and on budget. And I can tell you, we'll take some very serious measures to ensure that that takes place. So we are going to bring in a certain efficiency in our project management from the government's point of view. We are also going to look at the key public sector institutions to see that they would be able to generate the overall, not only profits, but also the objectives could be fulfilled through those institutions. So in the next few months and years, we would concentrate on making government a lot more efficient and delivering results on an ongoing basis, which are of a high degree of efficiency. Now, we would like to see the private sector doing the same thing. Sometimes we are told that the private sector is very, very efficient, and then we need to make the government as efficient as the private sector. But having been a private sector man for a larger part of my life and seeing the government as to how it works, I can tell you there's not much of a difference. I'm sure some of you may not agree with me, but if you really look at the government sector deliverables, they have delivered some awesome results. Who managed the COVID situation during this period? Who dealt with the war and the resettlement, the demining, and all those things? So if you just reflect on some of the achievements of the government sector, they're also pretty good. After the tsunami, they did the bulk of the work. When we had various disasters, floods, or droughts, the government sector comes to the forefront and deals with it. Disaster management, they come to the forefront and they deal with it. So I think we need to give some credit to the government sector also. But at the same time, that's not to say that the government sector has no room for improvement. Yes, there is tremendous room for improvement, and we are going to take the steps to improve. But in the next few years, I think one of the key factors in which our growth will occur is will be our ability to improve our performances. Not only will investment create growth, but capacity utilization also creates growth. Efficiency creates growth. Effectiveness creates growth. So where we can really score is that we have a very low base as far as our effectiveness and our performances are concerned. So we have to, as professional bankers, make use of your own talents as well as your ability to innovate, to think out of the box, and make sure that you are able to up the ante, as it were, to make sure that we are able to have a much better growth pattern built up in our country. So we have plenty to do. We have got some tremendous opportunities to also benefit by. We will have to get over the COVID challenge whilst we are going forward. I think it is like any other challenge. It will need some additional resources. We have already spoken about a new normal. Today, our seminar, which I can see now, has attracted around 234 people, which is about the number that we used to have when I was a governor, when we had a seminar of this nature. Of course, that was physical. But today, you have the same result through a virtual medium. So these are the new normal that we're talking about, and making use of that, we need to now go forward. So I want to say thank you very much to all of you for organizing a forum of this nature. I'm delighted to be here to share some thoughts with you. I attempted to give you a wide angle view of the thinking that went into the budget making, as well as the thrust of the President's growth agenda. And we would like you to be key partners in that journey. So let's look at how we can work together. And there will be occasions that you would need us to give you clarity or as well as direction. There would be occasions for us to come and ask you to assist the government's effort to take this agenda forward. And as partners, we look forward to taking this country forward together so that we can actually achieve the vision of prosperity and splendor that the President has articulated for this country, which has been endorsed by the people, and now it's up to us to implement. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Honorable Minister, for that deliberative discussion on the views of the budget. During these difficult times, Honorable Minister, I think you have been able to come out with a very illustrative budget in times of looking at all areas for the development of the country and the economic growth. So I think many opportunities are there for the bankers, as well as many businesses that have been created, and also the proposed new listing of small companies on the stock exchange, I think, is going to be a new area for the new companies so that they can extend their support to the economy. With that, we will take a few questions, Minister, or will you wait on, or how do you like?
I have another engagement by 8 o'clock, which will, so I'll have to break and leave at around 10 minutes to 8. So we have about 8 minutes. If there are any questions, I'll be happy to answer it in those minutes.
Honorable Minister, now you were talking about the foreign debt. Now the borrowings, we were depending on foreign borrowings, but in the budget you had proposed that there will be also some domestic area being brought into the borrowing factor to balance the debt. How would that materialize? In what case, if we are going to take a 50% from the local borrowing or 60%, what sort of a ratio? How would it plan? What's your thinking on that area?
Our idea is to ensure that we stay focused in not borrowing unduly from international markets. We want, if at all, we would do individual bilateral loans, which we find will be much cheaper now. During the period April 2018 to June 2019, in a span of just 15 months, we added $6.9 billion into our ISBs, which was a formidable amount. $6.9 billion is a huge sum, which is about 6 times the value of Hambantota ports. So that will tell you we have borrowed that amount without a corresponding asset which is visible in our country. So that's why we don't want to extend that any further. I think we have done that part to kind of a limit that we should really be looking at. But further loans will necessarily be only to replace existing loans. And while doing that, we would like to negotiate rates that are actually better than the rates that we have had to endure in the past few months. Now, if you see the ISPs of the recent past, we have borrowed at something like 7.8%, which is quite a high rate for a dollar-denominated instrument. And now, what we would like to do is to do what we should be doing, that is to negotiate directly with certain countries, certain institutions, so that we will be able to have much better rates of interest, which will bring our total interest cost down. We also see that our interest rates in relation to the rupee loans are also less, but we got to use that judiciously. If we overdo it, we'll find that the interest rates will go up further. That's why we got to be careful in how we manage it. And you can be sure that our debt management strategies will keep a close watch on these areas so that we don't bring in undue tension to the interest rates or to the rupee. So we'll have to manage it judiciously, and that will be the overall management style. But the goal that we have will be to bring the foreign debt down to a level of 40% of the total debt, and for local debt to be a sum of 60% of the total debt. But by 2030, I would actually like to see the local debt being 67% and the foreign debt being 33%. So we got to gradually move towards that range as well. So that's the overall objectives and the plans, and we intend to move towards those numbers gently. We're not going to give any major shock to the economy by saying tomorrow we want to do it. No, we will. Our style, even in the past, had been to have gradual trends being maintained so that we do not shock our system, and we would manage it carefully to reach those goals over a longer period of time, which I think would be the way to go.
Also, Honorable Minister, now there has been a lot of pressure with the depreciation of the currency, as well as we had a high interest regime in the last few years. But now gradually the interest rates have been coming down. Now, going forward, we'll be able to sustain this low interest regime, or will there will be a change in the interest rates because of the borrowing that we would go from the local side? Is there going to be any impact on that?
That's why I said we'll manage it judiciously. It's a question of management. We make sure that we manage it carefully, that we don't overborrow, and we have timing which is clearly done. You have seen that we have been able to make the borrowings in the recent 6 or 8 months without undue pressure being caused to the interest rates. And in fact, sometimes people are saying that the interest rates are too low. That condition we were able to maintain in 2014 as well. So 2013 and 14, if you remember, there was a low interest rate regime that we had built up. That has unfortunately changed. And then we found that the conditions changed drastically. But with careful management, we are confident that we can maintain that. And we will also keep a close watch on the banks to see that they also do not build up unnecessary pressure. And that will be something that we would like to see close cooperation from the banks as well. And that's something that I would like to leave as a thought to the Association of Professional Bankers as well.
Right. Thank you, Wilson. I think there's one question on the chat forum, whether there will be a negative interest rate like in the European countries or Japan in Sri Lanka. But is there any thoughts of that for negative interest in the economy in the future?
No, I don't think we have reached that stage as yet. I think this is a question of a overall migration or evolution. I don't think we would reach that stage too early in the next few years. But we got to maintain interest rates at these levels because that is what would spur the business on. That is what would also generate new developments in our country. We would also like to see the bankers working on their margins as well as their spreads to ensure that that spread is tighter. We did work on that in the past, in the year 2014 and all, and hopefully that will be something that you would pay attention to. And one thing that I should mention just before I leave is to say that we are once again giving the necessary impetus for consolidations of the banking and the financial sector. We will take that seriously. We would like to see the banks playing their role in that. We'd like to see the NBFI sector playing their role. We would like to see the numbers of companies being reduced quite significantly so that the stability is once again ensured. And these will be, again, some very important measures for the well-being of our economy and the banking and financial sector for the future. So, gentlemen and ladies, I want to thank all of you for having me on your program today. And I enjoyed talking to all of you. I'm afraid I will need to leave now. So may I say thank you and wish you all the best in your deliberations in the next few minutes as well as for the future. Thank you.
On behalf of APB, Honorable Minister, we thank you for accepting our invitation and participating. It was a really friendly chat and more elaborative explanations of all the budget overview that many of the bankers could see many opportunities with the new budget. And thank you very much for spending your time with this forum. And I hope we will see you and meet you and wish you good luck in all your future endeavors. Thank you. For a good night.
Thank you and good night.
With that, we will continue for the second segment of this webinar, which will start with the panel discussions, starting with Mr. Lakshman Silva, Director CEO, DFCC Bank, and Mr. Silva is the Chairman of the Sri Lanka Bankers Association and has been in the banking arena for over 30 years with DFCC, being previously heading the DFC Vardhana Bank as the CEO and also being the COO of the DFC Vardhana Bank, and after the merger, taking over the bigger giant of the development bank in one as a commercial bank in entity DFCC as its CEO. So over to you, Mr. Silva, to talk about some of the implications that we see from the budget where the banking sector could make use of it, and how we can make with these new suggestions that has come up in this budget, which has seen a different type comparative to the previous years of budget. We have seen a more development oriented. We have seen a lot of new investment type of channels being met, and keeping a new opportunity for bankers. So I think you could elaborate on some few points how we can go forward on this. Over to you, Mr. Silva.
And thank you, Jeremy. Hope everybody can hear me well. President of APB and the organizing committee. First of all, let me thank the APB for inviting me for this panel discussion. And the Honorable Minister had already explained the formalities with regard to the budget, what the government is looking forward for. On behalf of the banking community, I must first of all congratulate His Excellency Honorable Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance of submitting a very forward-looking, I would say, a budget. That for the budget actually denotes the somewhat stability of the political arena. It also shows how the government policies are going to be. It's not going to be short term, it looks like it is very long term. And also it shows that there are good corporate governance that are they looking for. And most importantly, the confidence that eroded over a longer period of time have been rebuilt, which all banks are also happy about. As most of us know, over the last several years, we had our own concerns with regard to the policy matters that have been implemented by respective regimes. As bankers, our contribution to the total economy was actually limited to a great extent by the factors that was beyond our control. So I believe the budget that have been presented will benefit banks, and also the bankers will be able to contribute more towards the economic development and the growth of the country, as the Honorable Minister mentioned a while ago. If I really look at this particular budget, also gives us the kind of uncertainty that we had to resolve that uncertainty. And it has given some confidence to the business community in general public, and especially the bankers. I believe that all of us are very upbeat about this, and we are expecting some energetic activities to take place in the market. And that will actually help all Sri Lankans to put the best foot forward and contribute for a sustainable economic growth in the years to come. So, as Jeremy mentioned, I would like to take this few minutes to highlight a few factors with relation the budget in relation to the banking. If you really look at the positive factors that this budget had given the bankers, I think government had identified through this budget priority sectors that they would like to develop in the few years to come. For example, they have identified the startups, which is actually an important sector in this country. And they have identified the logistics sector, construction industry, agriculture, which includes dairy and dairy manufacturing, and also renewable energy. So these priority sectors identifying at this moment of time through the budget, and providing concessions and incentives for the entrepreneurs of Sri Lanka to come up is an important thing. And as all of us know, as professional bankers, this time of the year, we are strategizing our plans for the next year and beyond. So I think we can easily consider these sectors as to our advantage and design our future business plans in that light to make not only the bank successful, but to make a contribution to the economy in a great sense. So I think that's a great advantage, because which we didn't have this kind of an opportunity in the past because of inconsistent policies that was around in the country. Second factor that I would like to highlight at this moment of time is the taxation matters that actually those had to be legislated, formalized operational guidelines have to be issued, but yet looking at the budget proposals, there are a few important elements of tax provisions that are giving the benefits to the banking community in general. As all of us know, in the last few years, not last few years, up to now, we are saddled with two sets of kind of financial information that are presented for various purposes. IFRS regime had come to Sri Lanka, and we are expected to present our financial statement on the IFRS basis, but continue to submit information to Central Bank of Sri Lanka in a different way. When it comes to the tax, it had been the central bank information that we provide is considered by the Department of Inland Revenue for tax computation of the banks. I think the budget have highlighted that the budget proposals are that Inland Revenue Department might now change their legislations, and I expect that to happen, where in a regime where we have expected loss to determine for IFRS calculations to be allowed as an allowable deduction for tax computation. But we are yet to see what the formalities are, whether it is going to be only for the individually significant exposures, how are we going to treat collective impairment are yet to be decided. But however, there is a certainty that we don't have to have these discussions, arguments with the Department of Inland Revenue in future, and we will be allowed to deduct our impairment provisions for tax computation purposes. The second important thing that I see in the tax side for the banking of the international exemption of capital gains and interest on international sovereign bonds. I think up to date we had the interest exemption, but the capital gains are also coming up. But no mention about the SLDB interest, but I believe that also will be addressed at the technical level. Duminda might be able to explain that to us a little more. So that's also an advantage for the banks to make some investment contribution to the economy and also to help the economic development activities. But having said that, I must also mention that there had been a limitation that had been brought in, where banks have to invest over $100 million if the banks to get this exemption. But I think in that sense, it's a limitation for medium-sized, smaller-sized banks. It is only will benefit only the larger banks. So I believe the regulators, the finance ministry will take up this matter. As SLBA, we will also make representation if possible to ensure the banking community in general will benefit out of this, and that will help to spur the economy of this country. Third important factor that I see is that, as Honorable Minister mentioned, consolidation process is being put forward. Initially for non-banking financial sector, where the banks have been invited to take stake in these financial institutions, which is a good move. And if that happens, we need to see the technical aspects of it as to how those investments are going to be treated. Would it be considered as an exemption for our calculation purposes, tax calculations? And also, some time ago, there was this, as Minister mentioned, there was a consolidation arrangement, a proposal was made. At that time, those such consolidations, the banks were permitted to charge their expenses through the consolidation, through the P&L. So I don't know, the finance companies also, when we make these investments, if at all, if any bank, whether that will be considered as an allowable deduction for tax purposes. So those are technical matters, but those are encouraging things that we can see. Then also we see that there is a possibility for banks to get an advantage by granting loans, making investments into startups. I believe that also need some clearances and clarifications because interest to be charged on the startups are only 4%, and whether the cost of investing, cost of funds will be permitted to be deducted from taxation for our tax computational purposes is question, but I think the government will resolve all those once the formalities are completed. So that's another important factor. While, as I mentioned to you, we have the opportunity to invest into priority sectors, Startups are given a special preference where we are allowed to deduct double taxation twice. So I believe the cost of the investment plus the interest is also deductible. So those clarifications have to be sorted later. In addition to that, I think additional opportunities the banks have got through this through this budget is something where I can see opportunity for banks to encourage more and more of mid-sized companies, corporates who are dealing with us to get listed in the market. That's an important factor, where because we find that most of these institutions are saddled with debts. So generating internal capital is an important factor, and that provides us an opportunity for another income stream. Banks themselves are very capable of assisting these companies to get into the listing into the stock exchange. So that will help our clients generating capital plus banks to have another income source. So those are some important factors. And SME sector also considered as per the Excellency's President's interest and the roadmap that he had developed. He is very keen to develop the SME sector, and the banks are going to get benefited out of that if we also support in that endeavor. The concerns and issues that I can highlight a few are like over the last few years, now even January this year, we were supposed to get our tax rates down to 24%. I believe still the legislation are not completed, and I hope, although there is no mention in the budget about it, the required legislation will be passed in the Parliament and will be given the opportunity to pay on taxes at about 24%, which is a great relief for the banking community, because as an industry, if you really look at, we are paying a huge amount of taxes to the government, whatever the revenue that we get. Second factor that I'm looking at, I'm a little concerned, is about the additional tax that had been introduced, 0.25%. On account of COVID, according to the budget proposals, any institution which has over 50 employees have to contribute to that. So the technical factors that we are yet to know, whether that contribution that we are going to make is an allowable deduction when we work out our profitability, financial services VAT, or income tax. Will it be an allowable deduction? So that will be indicated in our operational guidelines. Otherwise, it will be a huge cost to the banking community if we have to make a payment of that magnitude. Another interesting point the Honorable Minister mentioned, Honorable Prime Minister mentioned, is about bringing reforms into the Sri Lankan legal sector. I think it's a long overdue. All of us as professional bankers and who are responsible for the assets of the bank, and all of us know the amount of trouble that we have gone through. The Verité execution authorities are there for the banks, but I think it is like a toothless tiger at this moment of time. Banks are not being able to exercise those authorities. So I think legal reforms that are going to be brought in, setting up of special courts will help the banks to expedite our recovery processes, which are already hampered through these various non-performing ratios, which are where clients have not made payments to the banks. So unless the recovery processes are expedited, the banks are going to face a huge impact into their non-performing ratios. So I think that's a good direction the government is taking, where they would actually have this the reforms implemented. The final thing that I would like the government to relook at, if not in this budget very soon, is like the government had announced a tax structure, a consolidated tax methodology for liquor business, tobacco, gaming. Now, if professional bankers, all of us know how many types of taxes that we are paying. We are subject to financial services tax. We are liable for income tax. We have liable for agriculture tax. So there are so many taxes that the banks are now bombarded with. In addition to that, if this 0.25% tax also comes on board. So I believe the government will seriously look at, the government is very serious that the banks should contribute actively for the economic growth of this country. So in that sense, which is a very important sector, therefore, I believe the government would take up this position also and make sure there are certain whilst we are given some tax reliefs, whether there is a possibility of consolidating our tax methodology. So those are the factors that I would like to present to you. And thank you very much once again for giving me this opportunity. And I am free to answer any questions if there is some later on. Thank you very much. Over to you, Jeremy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Silva. So we will move on to the second panelist, Mr. Deshal de Mel. Mr. Deshal de Mel is the Senior Independent Director of Sampath Bank and is also the Research Director of Verité Research, and he has been a prominent economist in the Ministry of Finance. Previously he served. Over to you, Deshal, for your discussion on the implications of the budget, how the FDIs could be improved. What are the new things that you see from the economic side that will benefit our country?
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Can I be heard?
Yes. Visible.
Thank you. So first of all, I'd like to thank the APB for the invitation to speak to you this evening. It's a pleasure. So I'm going to share my personal views, mainly looking at some of the primary macroeconomic implications that emanate from the budget. So if we start by looking at the context in which the budget was presented. So if you look at the two biggest challenges that are afoot in the Sri Lankan economy, they are first of all the economic contraction that has resulted from COVID-19. That is something that is not unique to us; it's happening all over the world. And the second big challenge is our external debt management, and the fact that we have around $20 billion worth of external dollar debt maturing in the next 5 years. Management of that is also a critical challenge that from a macroeconomic perspective, Sri Lanka has to face going forward. So these two challenges would have been at the forefront of the thinking in terms of the budget. And what is particularly difficult in this case is that these two challenges are really competing. They require actions in almost different directions. So the economic contraction, for instance, warrants a strong fiscal stimulus to offset the negativity that you're seeing in terms of economic activity in the private sector. The government needs to provide fiscal stimulus to offset that. But on the external debt management side, that demands a path for fiscal consolidation. So the two challenges are demanding effectively opposite responses from the government. So that makes this a particularly challenging budget for the government to execute. Now, the 2021 budget is, I would say, very well focused on responding to this first challenge of growth stimulus. There are tax breaks provided for a number of targeted investments. There are incentives in capital markets that the state minister outlined. And there's also very substantial government capital expenditure that is proposed in the range of just about 6% of GDP. So all of these factors are important and positive in the sense that it provides the fiscal stimulus that is needed to offset the negative impact that we're seeing on growth right now. So in the context that we are having growth forecasts by the IMF for Sri Lanka of -4.6%, the World Bank of -6.7%, even prior to this current wave of COVID, this stimulus really would be supportive in terms of attempting to offset that. But the challenge is that this stimulus does result in the budget deficit also rising. So it rises, the budget itself is suggesting that it's going to rise to just under 9% of GDP. And this is really where things become challenging from the external debt management perspective. So if you read the commentary of the rating agencies, the key international banks, a lot of those institutions were expecting the budget to present a credible path towards debt sustainability. Now, this is not to say that the markets were expecting the budget to present a 5% budget deficit in 2021. That would be completely unreasonable given the macroeconomic situation that we're seeing not just in Sri Lanka but around the world. Many countries are seeing having budget deficits being expanded in the COVID context, precisely to provide that fiscal stimulus that is needed to support economic recovery in those countries. But what markets would have been expecting was for the budget to set out a policy framework by which we reach this reduced budget deficit, say a 5% deficit, within a period of 5 years. Now, what does Sri Lanka need to bring down a budget deficit to say 5% in 5 years' time? So the two obvious components in a budget balance are the revenue and the expenditure side. Now, if you look at both from Sri Lanka's perspective, Sri Lanka's revenue as a percentage of GDP in 2020 is likely to come to around 9%. And now if you compare this to our regional peers, so say India, for instance, who has revenue to GDP of close to 20%, Thailand around 21.4%, Philippines around 20%, Vietnam around 24%. So all of these, our peer countries have pretty much double and slightly more revenue as a percentage of GDP than Sri Lanka does. Even so, Sri Lanka had low revenue even before COVID. So that has been a critical factor in terms of Sri Lanka's budget deficits. Now it is also many people think that Sri Lanka's deficits are really due to extravagant expenditure, excessive expenditure, but that is actually not the case. So Sri Lanka's expenditure comes to around 19% of GDP, government expenditure around 19% of GDP, and that is also quite low compared to our peers. So India is at around 26%, Thailand 21%, Philippines 21%, Vietnam 28%, and so on. So you can see that all of these countries have a lot higher expenditure than we have, but they also have significantly higher revenues. Now, it's also important to remember that for Sri Lanka, it is quite challenging to curtail expenditure, because the fact of the matter is that a lot of Sri Lankan government spending is non-discretionary. So if you look at on an average year, government salaries would account for about 6% of GDP. Interest costs typically account for about 6% of GDP. Subsidies and transfers, including pensions, cost about 4% of GDP. So those items alone account for about 16% of GDP, right? And these are difficult to cut at the best of times, particularly during a pandemic. So with revenue remaining at 9%, already you can see how difficult it is to bring down the budget deficit by really hitting the expenditure side alone. So revenue is definitely a critical aspect when it comes to looking at Sri Lanka's budget. So reducing this fiscal deficit would necessarily have required some kind of shoring up of revenue. Now, the budget speech itself makes reference to increasing revenue from current levels to around 14.1% of GDP by 2025. But what really I felt was missing was the identification of specific revenue enhancement measures that will allow the revenue to grow as a percentage of GDP. So as the economy grows as nominal GDP grows, naturally revenue in absolute terms will grow as well. But it doesn't mean that revenue as a percentage of GDP grows, which is really what the critical item is when it comes to debt sustainability. Now there have been certain revenue measures that were mentioned. The GST that was proposed for certain goods such as alcohol, tobacco, vehicles, telecom, and so on. So that from what we have heard in the budget forum subsequently is expected to be either tax neutral or slightly tax positive based on administrative efficiency. The 0.25% turnover tax on in order to support a COVID insurance fund. Mr. Secretary of Treasury, Mr. Article today at a forum mentioned that fund would be outside consolidated fund. That also won't go specifically into government revenue. Cess and some other import taxes were due to be increased, but at the same time, customs duties have also been halved. So all in all, the revenue measures that have been proposed don't really seem to provide a path for having revenue being built up over time in order to really address the budget deficit. So what does this mean? So the outcome of this is that it's likely to be quite challenging for Sri Lanka to regain access to global bond markets in 2021. So that, and from what the statements you said as well, this means that the deficit is likely to have to be financed largely by domestic sources. So this is also a deliberate policy of the government. But from a macroeconomic perspective, what this means is that we'll expect to see a significant increase in the amount of fund that requires to be raised through the domestic bond and bill market. Now, typically what that leads to is when you have growing pressure on bond markets to raise money, whilst we are seeing a recovery in private sector credit demand as well. We've seen that since August, private sector credit has been positive, which is a great thing to see. But when those both go in a positive direction at that rate, you expect interest rates to start going up. So this will happen unless the central bank steps in with deficit financing, as they have done in 2020. Now, the risk of deficit financing is that it, of course, can be inflationary, and it can put a pressure on the current account deficit if it goes on for too long. So that is, again, something on the horizon that we have to keep an eye out on. So basically, in the absence of significant levels of foreign financing and global bond market access, we can expect local interest rates to start to increase sooner rather than later, and inflationary pressures also to start building, especially as the economy starts to recover post-COVID. Now, the big challenge that the government has to face in this context is in finding alternative financing sources to address this external funding gap. I mentioned the $20 billion maturing in the next 5 years or so. In 2021, Sri Lanka has $4 billion worth of sovereign liabilities maturing. And in 2022, we have another $4.5 billion of sovereign bonds maturing. So that's $9.5 billion of sovereign bonds alone. That's excluding the non-sovereign maturities as well. And we can also expect that, given the government's ambitious capital expenditure program, that also typically demands greater imports. So there could be also some upward pressure on the current account deficit as well. Now, with those numbers in mind, we also must keep in mind that our reserves right now are only at about $5.8 billion US. So what is going to be critical is really how the government articulates what measures we can have in place to meet this external funding gap between our reserve position right now and the known outflows that we have in our near-term horizon. So that's a major challenge that the government faces. The State Minister mentioned some measures in which that will be taken to try to address that. But I think that is something from an economic perspective we will all need to keep an eye out on. And hopefully the government will be able to put in place measures that will be able to address this rather pressing challenge, particularly in the context of a constrained global economic environment as well. Let me end there. I'm happy to take any questions as we come to a close. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much, Deshal, for that. We will move on to the next panelist, Mr. Anushka Wijesinha, and then thereafter we'll go into the Q&A session. Mr. Anushka Wijesinha is a economics personality, especially in trade and competitiveness and innovation. He also consults for international organizations in Sri Lanka, Maldives, and Myanmar. And he also serves on the board as independent director on Seylan Bank and many other financial institutions. So over to you, Mr. Wijesinha, to give a broad overview on the growth drivers that from the trade perspective that the budget has brought on the export side this time. So we can have some areas you could elaborate on some points that will be beneficial to the Sri Lankan economy.
Thank you very much, Jeremy. Hi, everyone. It's a good evening to all of you, and it's a pleasure to join this forum. Congratulations to APB for organizing this session. And I hope all of you are staying safe and well. I'll be focusing on some selected growth aspects of Budget 2021 and providing some reflections, particularly on relating to some sectors or certain sets of proposals. And I think I joined Deshal in commenting on the fact that this budget has come at a time of substantial international and national economic strain with the onset of COVID-19. And for Sri Lanka, it also comes on the back, remember, of an already difficult year last year following the Easter Sunday bombings. So bringing out a budget that has to attempt to generate growth back into the system is no doubt challenging. And in that context, both COVID plus the previous slow growth, it's not surprising that the budget does focus on supporting local economic activities, particularly rural activities like agriculture, dairy, and so on, becomes quite important in that context, given that there's a lot of vulnerability in those sectors, so it makes sense. While, of course, alongside continuing to support other activities like spending on social infrastructure like water, sanitation, which, as we know, have their own multipliers when you use public investment for those kind of social infrastructure projects. Moving on from there, let me highlight not all, but some selected areas which we saw a number of proposals based on my own interests and also why I think they're important. So the first set of proposals that I want to highlight are the ones relating to the digital economy and technology. The proposals relate mainly onto the ICT infrastructure side. On one hand, investments to increase the quantity, quality of access to the internet, digital technologies, as well as telecoms infrastructure. And on the other hand, also investments in technology parks. A total of around, I think, 18 billion is allocated for both of the above. Both of these will no doubt support this new and emerging growth driver in our economy, which is digital technology and IT services. And I think it's important that while we do continue to support sectors like agriculture and others, that we look for these new growth drivers. And I think we see consistency across previous budgets, across regimes as well recently, recognizing the role of digital startups, ICT services, and it's good to see that continuing in this budget as well. Particularly on the point of the technology parks in key cities. I think in particular this is very good because it will diversify some of those regional economies where those technology parks are due to be located and reduce those regional economies on their reliance on a few growth drivers at present, which makes their economic base very narrow. So setting up these technology parks in these key cities is a good move. It will also signal to young people in those areas on what careers they can pursue, what education choices to make. And it can also potentially resolve a key issue that the IT industry has been facing, even though they've been interested in locating out in those regions, which is a lack of commercial office space. And usually IT industries aren't really interested in putting up space themselves. They prefer plug and play type facilities. So this kind of solves that problem to some extent. Now, while the proposals have focused primarily on the hard infrastructure, telecoms, internet access, and technoparks, I think it's important to, moving forward, also focus on software infrastructure fairly soon. For instance, IT skills, including providing conversion programs for graduates to convert to IT in a short period of time. These are suggestions made by the industry body SLASCOM as well. But also other soft infrastructure by way of the right legislative and legal frameworks, cybersecurity, data protection. These have been formulated now for a couple of years, and I think it's time to get those done. An additional thought on this is that we have to be mindful that, setting up technology parks alone, these kind of bright spots or oases of new growth, alone may not be enough to help the economy become more knowledge and technology driven. Technology has to get mainstream through all sectors. We have a lot of unproductive sectors that require technology deployment in those to drive upgrading. And I think that's something we need to see happen more. We didn't see it in the budget, but I think this is something agencies can take forward throughout the economy, throughout the private sector, especially SMEs, the need to improve the digital readiness of SMEs, particularly to trade. This is something we've seen in Sri Lanka right now. Unlike other countries, telco access and digital access is there, but the usage and utilization for productivity improvement is not there yet. And this risks holding us back. So we have to, while recognizing the proposals made in this budget, we also have to look beyond in terms of mainstreaming technology throughout the economy. The second aspect I want to focus on is around the trade and industrial policy orientation of this budget. Clearly, there is a focus on import substitution. It's understandable that with the onset of COVID and the risks to our external income earning sources, like exports and tourism, there was a pressure starting from March to restrict outflows of foreign currency by way of restricting imports. And I think at the time, a lot of countries needed to do this. However, I think what's important is to not allow this to become a slippery slope towards a more inward-looking economy. And I think rolling that the protections in the right way at the right time is important. And I think we can be encouraged to hear that this is already being considered and looked into. I saw a news item that 2 ministers have been appointed to look into rolling back these back. And I think I would also advise a more rational approach to any further imposition of, as well as even lifting of those import restrictions. For instance, some years back, we provided a framework which takes a more scientific but also practical and rational way of approaching this under what was called the Trade Adjustment Program. It looks at factors like how sensitive will the tariff or para-tariff removal be to jobs. Also, it looked at, have those industries performed previously when they already had import protection in place? And I think these are some of the questions we need to ask instead of taking a blanket approach to imposing or even removing. Sri Lanka is a more trade-oriented economy than we were back when import controls were originally introduced. So we can't afford to take a blanket approach now. We have to take a more nuanced approach. The third aspect I'd like to mention is on investments. And we saw the FDI effort in this budget has relied quite heavily on tax incentives and also activating the existing Strategic Development Projects Act. On the SDP projects, in the past, there's been much debate on whether we should activate the SDP again or not. The fact is that the act is still in play, and the budget 2021 has articulated very clearly that tax incentives will be granted under the SDP. So I think this will provide a signal to some strategic investors, and hopefully we will be quite selective in what type of projects qualify for it. We also need to ask ourselves, though, that in the past, it's not as if Sri Lanka has not had recent efforts to encourage FDI through granting tax incentives for large projects, large investments. And we have to ask ourselves the question, natural question, why? And I think we need to start focusing on those factors and addressing them. Just one factor, for instance, particularly for export-oriented industries, is energy. FDI investors care about the cost of energy in comparison to regional competitor locations. And I think in this, you can see Budget 2021 contains quite a few proposals to increase the energy capacity, production, and hopefully that also brings down costs of energy in the medium to long term, an important factor that investors will look for. Alongside offering incentives under the SDP, going beyond that, I think it's important for us to get our pitch right. Having been involved in some investment promotion efforts in the past, I think the key challenge that we often face is articulating the pitch, why Sri Lanka? And also perhaps at a more granular level, why sector X, why sector Y, what is the proposition? And I think this needs to be nailed down. We are facing a lot of competition in the region, even as supply chains are getting upended because of COVID and the trade war. A lot of other destinations in the region are trying to latch on to that. Sri Lanka is not the only one. And to identify this pitch, we need to speak to investors, existing investors as well as prospective investors. So targeted investment promotion as a layer on top of these tax incentives is very important. Otherwise, I think it's ambitious to assume that just the tax incentives alone will be sufficient. For instance, using the networks of the existing investors here in Sri Lanka and using them as advocates to reach their peers, proactively identifying anchor investors and going after them consistently all the time. Famously, Vietnam quoted Samsung for many years, nearly a decade, before they finally agreed to come into Vietnam. The tax breaks alone weren't enough. In 2018, just a couple of years ago, they celebrated 10 years in the country. Samsung is now the largest foreign investor in Vietnam, with total investment of nearly 18 billion, which is about 10 times Sri Lanka's average annual FDI. And just Samsung alone exports $60 billion US, which is about 3 times Sri Lanka's total exports in a year. And Samsung also now has their main R&D center in Vietnam. That didn't happen magically. That didn't happen only because of setting up the infrastructure or the tax incentives. It was a combination of that plus a very strategic and consistent and determined effort to bring anchor investors in, understanding what they wanted, and creating the right enabling environment. So I think these are some things to look out for. Let me end there, just also to echo something that Deshal also mentioned regarding the financing piece. Again, to echo the fact that there's a lot of reliance on the domestic financial sector to finance the deficit. And I think for now, there appears to be plenty of liquidity in the market, and private sector credit growth is still tepid, but picking up. I think once these factors reverse, the pressures on financing domestically will become more acute. And the question, as the State Minister also acknowledged, will be that balance to ensure that there is no crowding out. And I think here I hope we also move more towards away from the kind of concessionary loan schemes to things that will help access to finance in a more sustained manner, focusing on a credit guarantee fund, focusing on export credit insurance, things like that, which after the immediate COVID period, we need to start moving beyond some of these concessional loan schemes, which is usually the first response that we get. But I think to sustainably enable access to finance, we need to move beyond that. And these will become important next year as credit growth picks up and the pressure on domestic financing increases. So I'll end my comments there, and happy to take questions in the Q&A. Thank you, Jeremy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anushka, for that elaborative discussion on the trade drivers and the possibilities of what we can take home. Finally, we have Mr. Duminda Hulangamuwa, Senior Partner of Ernst & Young, and he's a specialist in the tax area. And I think we could sum up some of the areas on tax, how from the current budget, against the comparative with the previous budgets, where we see new changes in the tax regime, which came early part of January, certain taxes, but in the recent budget, only certain sectors were given some budgetary concessions on the tax side. So Duminda, if we could elaborate on some areas that are going to impact the banking sector and some benefits that the industries that could take from these tax concessions.
Yeah. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's quite late in the day, so I won't take much time. Current budget has already been touched upon by Lakshman and Deshal. So I'll just provide a brief answer to some of the questions that Lakshman raised. With regard to the insurance premium that is going to be charged, I find to be deductible. They have to bring a special section to the Inland Revenue Act, because what is deductible under the general law is only what is incurred for the production of income. So this is not incurred for the production of income. So they'll have to have some special law which permit the deduction of this insurance premium. The second thing that affects the banks, so I'm only, Jeremy, touching what affects the banks. I'm not going to take time to discuss other areas. Is on this capital gains exemption that has been granted for investments in Sri Lanka sovereign bonds. If you invest in anything in excess of $100 million, I doubt whether they can be extended to Sri Lanka development bonds, because I don't know whether development bonds have a secondary market. So sovereign bonds are secondary market, and there was a defect in the law. They only granted the interest part. The exemption is granted from income tax, all taxes, capital gains and interest income, only for non-residents. So development bonds, at the moment, there is no intention is only for sovereign bonds, which will have a secondary market. With regard to the deductibility of the loan loss provisions, also, I don't know how, whether it will be more restrictive or it is something going to be where they are going to grant you to deduct the loan loss provision as special RFS, or they are going to say that deductions will be granted only for actual debts incurred, because Inland Revenue's position is that the deduction of loan loss provisions erode into the tax base of the department, and therefore revenue collection drops, and they should give deductions for bad debts only where legal action has been filed and amount has been written off. So they are going to go back to that, or they are going to be more generous in granting you the SLRFS. I don't know. So we have to wait and see. But that is the news I get from the department is that this is the reverse. So we have to wait and see how the law gets enacted. Then with regard to, there's one more item with regard to provisioning, but the provisioning for the Sri Lanka International Sovereign Bonds, which has been suspended for 3 years, will not affect the tax provisions, because anyway the provisions are deductible for income tax. As far as the question that Jeremy raised to me on the proposals announced in January as this government came into office, or as the president came into office, we requested from the chamber and from all the places not to, however much it can be afforded, but the government not to change those tax laws, because we need to have consistency at least for 5 years. And the government has honored that, in my view, that they are not changing any of the tax laws that were proposed in January. So whatever that was proposed as of the DRL and the NBT has been already passed in Parliament. The Inland Revenue amendments will come into Parliament next year, because there is no time now to introduce bills in Parliament. Once the budget debate is over, the Parliament will recess for this year, and next year they will begin, and then they will draft the laws and present to Parliament next year. So all the income tax amendments that were granted to individuals with very concession, with very generous tax rates, as well as tax-free allowance of 3 million, all those things will come into effect only from next year. There won't be change to any of the proposals that were made in the aftermath of the presidential election. So, Jeremy, what I thought, in the interest of time and people who are there, I will stop at that. I don't want to discuss the entire budget because it may not be relevant to the audience. So if there's any question that someone wants to raise or the panel wants to raise, I can take it up at the question time.
Yeah, thank you very much, Duminda. I think there was a few questions posted on the chat. One, I think we need to is addressed to Deshal on the chat forum. The government, this is to Deshal, the government was not given any rapid financing facility from IMF for COVID. And it seems that we are not continuing even with IMF programs. Will this create negative sentiments on our physical consolidation and refinancing of foreign debt? Any comments, on this?
Yeah, Jeremy. So the IMF, global markets really use IMF as a signal. It's not really the quantum of money that an IMF program brings in. That's normally quite small compared to the liabilities that a country has. But the IMF can be a signal to global markets that a program where, a country where they have a program is on a fiscal consolidation path or on the appropriate macro framework that global markets want to see. So really, it's like having a certificate from a university. So you can study and learn a subject, but you can't really go to an employer unless you have a degree certificate. So when the employer sees a certificate, he's like, oh, okay, hey, this guy has done the work and he studied. I'm happy to take you on. But that doesn't mean that you can have a certificate without doing the work. So the IMF is really kind of just provides a signal that that the country is serious and has done the work that's required. So without IMF, it becomes less easy to signal to global markets that we are serious about the path that we're taking. But still, the most important thing is to do the work ourselves and get our own house in order.
Thank you, Deshal. Mr. Silva, there's one question on the development banking. Now, the budget proposal brought in a suggestion for creation of a national development banking corporation by merging some of the state institution banks. Now, traditionally, we had two development banks in Sri Lanka, and also they merged into more commercial entity banks. But again, the government has thought of the development bank inside. What's your views on this, Mr. Zila?
I think the government point of view, a country like Sri Lanka do need a dedicated development bank to say. I mean, that is the demand people are making. But if you really look at the banking, why we could not sustain on a development banking proposition is that there is no separate legislation applicable for development banking per se. All the development banks has to are managed under the same monetary act which is available in the market. So be it not performing ratios, the liquidity ratios, there are some other key factors that the bank has to maintain. So when you look at all those, I find it difficult to find a development bank to sustain with those models. So I think government, it seems like the government is very serious of having a development bank. This had been debated for a long period of time. Only thing that I would like to see that if it is a development bank is coming up again on a consolidated form or an individual basis, I think the Central Bank of Sri Lanka and the other authorities need to look at how to frame, how to structure a development bank in this country, what kind of concessions the development banking can be offered, those institutions can be offered, without which it will be difficult to sustain. So I think the priority has to be taken by the legislator, bring in new laws with regard to the development banking, and that will help. And as some of my colleagues in the panel mentioned, that needs guarantee schemes, that needs various other aspects possible where to support the economic development and the people who are interested on development banking. So I think since the government had taken this initiative, I believe they would also go to the second step of making these amendments required to make an exclusive development bank is free from the normal monetary act that is prevailing in the market.
Yeah, thank you, Mrs. Zila. Anushka, one area that the budget proposed this year was the encouragement for local industries. Now, in terms of the trade to generate more revenue, export market for such of the local products like the batiks or the handicrafts or the certain products that we could manufacture locally and create an international market to generate export rate. What's your thoughts on those areas, how we could further use innovation to bring more export revenue to the country?
Yes, thanks, Jeremy. So I think I would separate things out like things that are unique to Sri Lanka, that are what I would call, heritage products, cultural products like our batik, handlooms, and so on, where I think it's an excellent idea. There's a big market globally for these kind of products, authentic products, products that have a good development story to tell. And I think it's an excellent idea to promote those and use any trade policy measures necessary. Those are things that nobody even internationally can really contend with, or rather, get offended with Sri Lanka for. Then there's a whole bunch of other products that are internationally traded, do have competitor imports. And I think that is where we need to be a bit more granular, a bit more specific and detail oriented in how we approach how those sectors are supported. Now, I can understand, as I mentioned in my earlier remarks, the need to use some import protections initially during COVID because of forex concerns. However, moving beyond those immediate concerns to those using the import restrictions as the tool of industrial policy, I think that's where we need to really take a closer look. My preferred approach is to support industries with the competitiveness factors that they need in order to thrive. And there's a lot of things that hold back these domestic industries unrelated to things like tariffs and paratariffs. For instance, trade facilitation, logistics, around issues around digital, around standards compliance. So there are a lot of things that we can do to improve the productivity and competitiveness of our domestic industries that sometimes don't have anything to do with tariff protection. So I think finding the right balance between this is important, and I hope that our efforts are weighted more towards improving the competitiveness and productivity of our domestic industries in a more sustainable manner, where those industries no longer have to rely on trade restrictions or protection and things like that, and can truly become competitive. Because we really have to remember that we are a small domestic market, 20 million population, and even for a business, a smart business should think, is Sri Lanka my only market, or is markets in our region? And if you look at some of the successful companies in Sri Lanka, they are the ones who compete internationally. You talked about innovation. It is competition that drives innovation. And I think the companies that are exposed to international competition are the ones who have innovated and become world-class, whether it's our apparel industry, rubber products, and even our automobile components, impact sensors, electronics, and so on. So there's a lesson to be learned from the companies that are already successful, innovating, and have world-class products, that they did it by opening themselves up to the world.
Thank you, Anushka. Duminda, there was one question posted with the non-banking financial sector, the tax breaks. Any specific area that would be coming, because now financial consolidation also has been looked into in this budget proposal, and the type of tax breaks or which will be encouraging for the joint venture or the merging institutions. Could you have some sentiments on that area?
Yes. So the budget proposals announced that they are going to bring back the deductibility of costs incurred on acquisition of companies under the financial sector consolidation process. So as you know, up to about 2014, when this process took place, a person who's buying an unbanked financial institution was given 100% reduction of the capital investment against their income to the taxable profit as a qualifying payment relief. So I believe the same thing has been proposed. For a merger, there won't be a reduction, because in a merger there is no cost to incur, but only in the acquisition that you incur a cost, and that cost will be deductible. One more point, Jeremy, that was not touched here was this proposal for the government to extend the retirement age of the private sector worker and the EPF. So it's only policy stage yet. I spoke to the secretary. I don't know what their planning is. If at the moment the private sector does not have a compulsory retirement age, it's not mandated by law, it's a contractual agreement. If you mandate to 60, on the other side, you're removing the choice of the person, the private sector companies to engage the person that you want to. Secondly, I don't know if you make the retirement age 60, whether you have to wait for 60 years to get your EPF out. So that is a catch-22 clause, is where if you extend it to 60, then those who would have otherwise retired at 55 and got the EPF will now wait for 60 years to get the EPF. So that there is no proper answer that I got from the government yet.
Thank you, Duminda. Deshal, one point was about the sustainability of the interest rate in the second quarter. Certain predictions from rating companies state that the likelihood of the rate would go up due to the pressure for the local borrowing. The state minister also advocated certain things that they will minimize maybe a 40-60% borrowing. Any thoughts on that area? How the outlook of the interest rates would be? Most of the depositors, especially the senior citizens who are living on the interest rates, look forward for some earnings on that interest. But now with the rate declining, they have a significant problem for their sustainability of their long-term life. Any idea on that?
Yeah, I mean, as I was saying, I think if the government is not able or not keen on really having a larger share of foreign financing of the budget deficit, that means that a good part of the budget deficit is to be financed by the domestic market. So in this case, the budget deficit is expected to be around 1.5 trillion rupees. That's what's in the budget, and a lot of that is likely to be coming now from the domestic bond market. And that would be a significant increase from what we have seen in the past. Now, in 2020, there still was a very large domestic borrowing component, but that was managed because you had central bank deficit financing. And that also was managed because we had very low private sector credit growth and credit demand. Now, hopefully in 2021, we will see a recovery of private sector credit demand as the economy recovers and we see activity, demand for greater credit for working capital purposes, for expansions and so on. Now, when that happens, then you're going to see demand for credit liquidity both from the government and from the private sector as well. So in that context, you're likely to see interest rates, pressure on interest rates starting to build up. The timing, the timing will really depend on how much the central bank is willing to continue to deficit finance. If they're willing to extend that further, then of course the timing of the increase in rates can be delayed some more. But I think what we're seeing is, looking at the way the fundamentals are moving, there will likely be an increase in interest rates probably at some point in the latter part of the first half of this year.
Thank you, Deshal. Mr. Silva, one final question just before we wind up. The banks worldwide are now facing these challenges to manage the financial resources such as the capital, liquidity, the revenue, the cost, and the risk. Those are the 5 core areas that most banks would be looking in managing the financial resources. And in Sri Lankan context, the banks also have similar challenges in going forward. Any thoughts of that, how banks could overcome certain of those challenges with the future development of the economic growth, and assuming that the COVID injection that would come out will be a successful one across, so how it would be beneficial to the financial sector?
Thank you, Jeremy. I think the banks are challenged on these capital augmentation plans already. And as you correctly mentioned, and also the Honorable Minister mentioned, that the banks will be under tremendous pressure to bring down their margins down. So along with that, I think capital preservation is becoming a major challenge for banking sector. Now, I know that some of the capital raising matters that happen not only for banking but in general, because of the subdued activities in the capital markets in the past, be it share issuance or when it comes to the debenture issuance or the debt instruments. We had banks faced many challenges in taking those off and also to get the expected results. So I'm hopeful that if the capital markets turn around and there is positive sentiments with the investors, there would be a chance for the banking sector to generate the required capital through the local means, or as we see, majority of the financial institutions stakeholders are also from abroad. They also need to see the positiveness in Sri Lanka, then only that they would subscribe to these requirements. So I think COVID, finding a resolution to COVID is an important factor. And second factor is that as to how, as my colleagues mentioned in the panel, as to how the Sri Lankan economy will move towards a sustainable economic growth, and how would we manage our exchange rates, how would we manage the interest rates, and primarily as to how would we protect the FDIs or the investors who are coming to Sri Lanka to make investments, whether they will be protected, whether they will be given enough opportunities, and whether they will be given relief, because the current situation is not that sound. I think the positive sentiments that have been expressed by the government, and if the government maintains consistent policies towards the next couple of years, I believe that the banks will be able to generate the required capital. And through other means, even though the margins are going to be challenging, by preserving the profitability, I think the banks will be able to meet the capital requirements. But having said that, there are a few banks which are challenged with these capital requirements, and that is why the government is proposing also at the moment for a bank consolidation. I think that is also going to be a key in the next few years.
Thank you, Mr. Silva. I think time is up now. It has been a long day. On behalf of APB Continuous Professional Development Committee, I take this opportunity to thank Honorable Minister Ajith Nivard Cabraal for accepting our invitation and being with us to share his thinking of the government, how the development was done and how the budget was developed and what are the benefits that we are going to give. And to our panelists, Mr. Lakshman Silva, Deshal de Mel, Anushka Wijesinha, and Duminda Hulangamuwa, for readily accepting our invitation and spending your valuable time with us. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for being part of this session with APB. And of course, to all participants, I think for patiently waiting and hearing for these eminent speakers, giving encouragement to APB in organizing these events. And of course, APB will come up with future more events of this to educate and create the awareness among the membership. And thank you very much, the President and Council members, the advisors of the Council, and special thanks to Mr. Henanayaka Bandara for giving us the opportunity to get connected with the Minister and have him here today. Thank you very much, Mr. Henanayaka. And also to my committee, Continuous Professional Development Committee, for assisting me in organizing this seminar, and to our APB Secretariat, Rekha, for coordinating the events. Thank you very much. Good night. Stay safe.